What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Introduction to Comparative Politics. I hope that you had a wonderful weekend. I hope that you feel rested and ready to go, because today we're going to deal with our first thematic issue of the course, which is states and state formation. And we're going to do this in a variety of ways, but what you'll see is that we'll be using a lot of the skills that we've already developed in earlier classes to analyze the issues that we face in this area of comparative politics. So we'll be using comparative methods, but we'll also be working on concept formation and measurement as well. And so today, our objective is to both explore the concept of states and state formation, and then also measure and kind of assess the different measures of state strength and state formation. And this then will use both our analytical and comparative reasoning as well as the more conceptual side that involves reflecting on the meaning of the concept and the understanding of the concept that we use in comparative politics. So I'm very excited to get started, and I want to remind you that the lecture materials are all available on CAT courses. I'm getting better at posting the recorded lectures as well as the slides immediately. And so those are available to you whenever you need them, and you can revisit them in the future. And of course, I encourage you to use them to study as well. So let's get started. The first and most important question is, what is the state? And I want to introduce this debate or this issue in a way that I introduced science and the comparative method in earlier classes, by posing a series of statements that seem very familiar and that we may even see often in our own reading or the work that we do in classes, but that is actually maybe questionable in some way. And so let me read these statements to you, and I want to put it to you and invite you to respond in the chat after I read these statements. So first, the state is the current government. Second, the state is a unit within a country, as in the state of California. Third, the state is a nation with its own government and territory. Now, I want to put it to you, what do all of these statements have in common? Tell us in the chat. I'll give us a moment to reflect, and in a few minutes, I'll read your input and I'll incorporate it as we go along. Efren says it deals with government. Dorian puts one. I think that, oh, Dorian says a few steps down, there is a democratic government in the US. Stephen says all of these have some truth but are not the entire definition of what a state is. Anna Martha says that they are already a state. Dorian says there is a bit of a divide in our government due to the different political and social ideals that both the Republican and Democratic parties have. Alexis says all the statements define a state as either having a government or having a territory. Now that's an interesting point, Alexis. That's a note that we want to take and keep in mind as we move forward, because that's going to become really, really important. That is one dimension of a bigger picture that will paint as we go along, territoriality. Nina says, these statements are uncommon as they all say that a state has unity within their specific area through a government. So there's this idea of maybe uniformity through a central government that establishes some hierarchical set of relationships. Certainly, that seems to be in here somewhere, although maybe not that explicit. ISIS says a description of a state in terms of territory and government. Okay, so ISIS and Alexis are picking up on a similar point here, which is that there's a role for territoriality, and that within that territory there's some sort of central government or some ruling government. Okay. Valentine says what these statements have in common is that a state governs over a unity of people in a certain area with its own laws. Okay, that certainly is a set of dimensions that will associate with the state, law and order and the establishment of a system of laws in a territory and over a human community or a set of groups or a society, if you will. Dorian says the states in the US don't necessarily have their own government, but they do have different sets of laws. Interesting, Dorian. So I'm wondering if you think that understanding or that notion of a state is different or similar to what we're discussing here and that we've read about for class today. Alejandra says, the state is a vague word that needs context. That's absolutely true, Alejandra. And what we'll see is that the notion of the state is an abstraction. It's not a concrete entity. It's really something that exists only as an idea. And in that sense, it is very vague and it needs context. And what I think Alejandra's pointing out here is that there are actually a variety of contexts in which this notion is used. And so its precise meaning might be very elusive. And this is absolutely right. And I think that we're picking up on that throughout our commentary here. And what I see over and over is that there's sort of an emphasis on territoriality and maybe a ruling government and maybe a unity of some kind among people. But beyond that, there are questions about whether we mean states in the United States or states within a country, or if we mean sort of like politically bounded territories with the central government that are countries that are recognized as independent countries. What we mean is really unclear, and this is precisely the sort of confusion that persists quite a bit in popular discourse and even in political science in some areas. There's a lot of uncertainty or lack of clarity about what the state actually is. And so the first and most important question of all when we deal with the analytical question of states and state formation is, what is the state? And that's a descriptive question. And this involves our conceptualization and our reflective capacities as much as it does our analytical ones. And really, we're thinking almost philosophically here. What is the state? What do we mean by that? In what way are we measuring it based upon our understanding of its meaning? And so today, we're going to develop this concept and figure out what the state is and what we mean by the state, so that when we begin to analyze the question of states and state formation, we have a clear benchmark or standard with which to proceed. And so let's proceed. Wow, I'm very sorry about that. My apologies. We're still here. Okay. So all of those statements are wrong. As several of us pointed out, there are some grains of truth and some dimensions in there that really seem relevant. Like, for example, territoriality, a role for some sort of central government or some ruling entity, uh, boundaries of some kind that are firmly established in some way relative to other units. But all of those are wrong because they're too sort of diffuse and they focus on elements that don't actually matter. And they focus on things that we don't think of as the state in comparative politics. Now, we don't mean the current government. The current government certainly is in charge of the state and the set of institutions that we associate with the state, but the current government is something else. The current government is composed of people who we can identify, and we can identify the prime minister or the president or the Senate leader and so on and so forth. But the institutions of the state, the bureaucratic entities that form a complex constellation of authoritative organizations that impose and develop laws, these institutions are much more difficult to identify. And what they form together, more importantly, is something that doesn't have a precise legal personality. It's really something much more abstract. It's a set of institutions that forms what we really would think of more as an idea because of what they collectively are doing or seek to do. So it's not the current government. It's also not a unit within a country. Certainly, California is a state, but as we'll see here momentarily, it's not the state. We distinguish between states or a state in the context of the United States and the state, which we might think of as the US state or the American state. But still, that's an abstraction that's going to be very different than the legal personality that we associate with California. California represents itself in court, but there is no entity that we would think of as the state of the United States. There's the US government, and the US government's representatives represent the US government and then in effect the state more broadly, but the state is an abstraction that is not this precise. And the state of California, moreover, is simply a unit within a country, not the state. And then finally, the state is not a nation with its own government and territory. What you'll see is that some states have many nations. And it's also the case that some nations span several states. And so all of these are wrong. And let's elaborate this a little bit further. Remember that I told you that a government is a concrete entity. Donald Trump is the president of the United States. We can identify the head of the government in this regard. It's a concrete entity with figures who represent themselves in the government, but it's concrete, identifiable. It doesn't exist as an idea. It's an actual representational form. The state, by contrast, is just an idea. It's a set of institutions that together forms a whole, but that whole is really something more amorphous, and it doesn't exist in a concrete way in the way that the government, as composed of the president and the cabinet, exist in a concrete way. And so to extend this idea, that it's also true that governments come and go. There's an election on November 3rd. The United States people may or may not re-elect Donald Trump. The truth is that governments come and go every 4 or 8 years, or however many years elections are spaced apart. The state is always there, however. The state, its institutions are permanent fixtures of something that really is much stickier and doesn't go away overnight, and really doesn't really ever go away unless the state fails for reasons that we'll discuss later on in the course. So state versus government is the most important distinction of all as we begin to develop this concept. The government is certainly in charge of the state, and the government is concrete, but the state itself is an abstraction. It does not exist in anything other than an idea that exists in our heads, that we associate with this set of institutions that forms a whole that functions in a way that is not concrete, but is much more amorphous and really is just an idea. So let's give you an example to make this more concrete. If you went to Japan, you'd find the head of state in Emperor Akihito. You'd find the head of government in Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. These are two different figures who have very different roles and responsibilities. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe theoretically won't be there forever or really that long in the grand scheme of things. By contrast, the emperor is a much more permanent fixture, as is the state. By definition, the emperor is associated with continuity and persistence, as are the institutions of the state in charge of the development of laws and enforcing the general rules in a society. And so when you think of the difference between the state and the government, you can think of the difference between the prime minister, whom is elected by the dominant constituency after a parliamentary election, and who will only be there however long that coalition is in power. And then the emperor, who is there essentially indefinitely and by definition, permanently. And so we begin to develop this distinction between state and government. Let's also talk about the distinction between the state and a state. Now, California is a state. You may also say it's the state for other reasons, but we don't mean that here. We mean to say that it is one among many states understood as units within a country. That is a geographical notion, right? You're thinking about something that is distinguished on a political basis, but geographically. The state, by contrast, is an institution, as we already said. What we really mean are sets of organizations that form a whole and who pursue specific goals of economic and political and social importance. That is the state. It's an institution, not a geographic reality. So California is a state in a geographic sense, in a political geographic sense, but it's not the state. The state is something else, and that is what we're here today to discuss. Finally, let's distinguish between state and nation briefly. We will analyze the question of nation formation later in the course, but for now, it's sufficient for us to just lightly cover that idea, and so that we can distinguish it from states and state formation. So a nation is really a political identity. It's a collectively held idea, if you will, shared by people whom form some group and often have shared characteristics of some kind. But really, it's an identity or an idea that exists in the heads of people who may be very, very different racially and ethnically and religiously and so on, or maybe very, very similar. The point is, it's an idea. It's not an institution. And an institution is really a more sort of structural thing represented by buildings, right? Buildings and hierarchies and organizations that pursue specific goals. That's different than an identity, which is a commonly or collectively held idea. And so to take this further, it's important for us to understand then that there are multinational states. And then there are also nations that span several states. So for example, Afghanistan and Belgium, Bolivia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, these are all multinational states. States where multiple nations or multiple different political identities are all within the borders of a single state. And so it's not true that a nation is the basis for a state, because there are multinational states. And by the same token, there are multi-state nations like Korea, Kurdistan, etc. That means, moreover, that these nations that are often held up as quite important sometimes span several states and may not have a state of their own. And so both the nation and the state are really separate entities. We'll see that the state is involved in cultivating the nation so as to legitimize the state, but they're not necessarily linked in terms of the way we conceptualize the state. So for example, Switzerland is one state with many nations, and there are multiple language groups in Switzerland: Swiss, Italian, German, Italian, and French, if I'm not mistaken, and then even some others. But the point is, there are multiple nations in Switzerland. There's no one nation in Switzerland. And so the idea that Switzerland, the Swiss state, would be based upon a single nation with its own territory and government is simply false. This is an example of how we can have a variety of different nations or groups within a single state simultaneously. Kurdistan, on the other hand, is one nation with many states. So Kurdistan, the Kurds don't have a state of their own. This is the whole point. The Kurds are often abused and have to escape all sorts of repression because of this reality. They don't have a state of their own. They're often a minority in a place where some other nation is essentially in power or controls the state. So we have one nation, many states in Kurdistan. Korea is another example. There are examples in Africa as well, including in Nigeria and surrounding countries. But the point I want to make to you is that the nation is not necessarily linked to our understanding of the state. It's not an essential component. And we'll see, moreover, that they are quite independent in some ways, although sometimes linked as well, when we begin to discuss the specific objectives and activities of state institutions involved in nation building. So we arrive at this question: if not a government, if not a unit within a country, if not a nation with its own territory and government, what is the state? What is this thing that we understand as an abstraction formed by sets of state institutions pursuing specific goals, but not necessarily linked to the nation and not necessarily a unit within a country? And by definition, not a unit within a country. So I want to put it to you, and I want to incorporate as much input as possible, like before. And I want to challenge you to think through this. I know this is a difficult question. It's a difficult question for me as well. It remains difficult for all of us. That's why we wrestle with this in comparative politics. But I want to hear it from you, and I want to know what your understanding of the state is. So give it your best effort. Use the chat. You can either message me privately or you can message the class. But I do want to incorporate your input, and I'm excited to see where we can go with the discussion before we eventually engage in some more applied comparative and conceptual reasoning. So let's take a moment, and I want to hear it from you. What is the state? Ian says, a state is a collective accumulation of a community or population's international identification. Anna Martha says, the political organization, economy, revenue, etc. Good, good. So we're incorporating a number of dimensions here. Everything from the collective or the nation or the community to the political organization, the format of the economy, sources of revenue for the government. These are all components of the state, without a doubt. The infrastructure or the constellation of institutions and systems involved in revenue generation, organizing, and kind of ordering politics and political competition, that's all part of the state. And it's good that you're picking up on that, because the state doesn't just do one thing. And that's where a lot of the complexity comes from. It's not just politics. It's also the enforcement of property rights and the promotion of economic development through contract enforcement, and et cetera, stuff like this. And so thinking about the state as a complex, multidimensional creature is important from the get-go. Stevens says the state is an open-ended concept used to conceptualize territories and their beliefs and cultures. So there certainly is a role for this territoriality and this kind of boundedness that we associate with the borders that are established through whatever means so as to demarcate one country from another. That territoriality is important because it's the area within which the ruling entity or the state or the institutions, if you will, implement and enforce the rules. And so that territoriality is really important. And we'll see again and again how that becomes important, not just in how we conceptualize the notion, but also how we measure certain concepts like state strength as well. And so keep that in mind and put an asterisk next to territoriality. Christiana says, states are a result of war that typically are found in more developed countries that provide leverage to people who can move from different areas to places that coincide more with their beliefs. Christiana is onto something here with this discussion of the role of war. We'll see on Thursday that war does play an important role, but that the type of war is an important factor. And moreover, that there are some sort of geographic and historical and regional disparities between certain areas of the world and their experience with war and state formation. And so war is important, and it's through war that a lot of the mechanisms of state power are developed. And we'll see that and how that plays out in different cases. And we'll also see how war might not actually serve those same purposes based upon some slight changes in the circumstances. Very interesting stuff. We'll look into that more on Thursday. Alexis says, a collection of individuals with similar beliefs, cultures, communication styles, or political ideologies that coexist to form a harmonious unit that works towards the economic wants and needs of its people. So there's certainly this kind of community or this kind of collective sort of component, right? There's this constituency over which these institutions rule. But what we'll see is that the people themselves, interestingly, figure into our definition of the state less, because we're talking about state institutions and essentially political organizations that rule precisely that community. Now, the community becomes essential when we talk about their acceptance of the state institutions and whether they deem those institutions to be legitimate. And so, although we focus primarily on the institutions when we define the concept, our understanding in our way of measuring state strength is very closely linked to the extent to which the society and the community accept and embrace the state. And so we'll see then that society has an interesting role to play, but one that might not be as central to the concept of the state itself as a set of institutions. And so we'll see how this all plays out as we go along, and we'll be dealing with this over and over. Nina says, the state is an abstract concept used to help people grasp a better understanding of where they reside and helps them gain a sense of identification and community within their state. It's an abstract concept, and it does help to forge an identity or create a basis. What we'll see is that states often pursue nation building as an objective. They often do try to create community and to stimulate the formation of a collective consciousness, precisely because that does typically help to legitimate the state itself and to kind of perpetuate the state itself. Now, the state itself is not a creature. Remember, it's a set of institutions who may be working in unison, in cooperating, or who may not. And so we'll see that as well. But remember that the state, we think of as that set of organizations who rule over this human community and help to kind of solidify the community, but who may, in some sense, be independent or separate from the community. Now, whether it's separate is a question that we'll deal with, and the autonomy of the state is an important question in comparative politics. And so State and society are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but conceptually we might think of them as separate or different. Samantha says Efren here, if it's not a government nor a unity within a country, then a state is territorial occupation by a political identity. It does not have a clear structure of political, so its identity can be based on economic, military occupation, or other socioeconomic engagements. So Efren, that's exactly right. The state, as a set of institutions, doesn't necessarily have a certain ideology or identity. It can create and recreate that identity as it sees fit in order to pursue its own specific ends or to pursue specific objectives. And so certainly identity is not exclusively tied to the state, but the state can create identity and can cultivate identity as part of an effort to support and to promote the interests of the state or of some ruling class or some interest group who has great influence within the state. Caesar says, another take I want to take is the condition in which the institution finds itself, for example, the state of our nation or so forth. Yeah, so the question of the strength of the state or the kind of relationship between social actors in the state, these are important questions. These questions will figure into our measurement in our sort of conceptualization of state strength as a concept associated with the state and this notion of the state. And so those relationships do become important. And I want to reiterate that though we think of the state as a set of institutions kind of separate from society, the strength and autonomy of the state we'll see are closely linked to the nature of the relationship between the society and the state, as represented in, say, armed insurgencies or peace or order or conflict and so on. ISIS says the state is several communities united for a same end, such as economic development as a whole. Good, so ISIS is pointing out that there's a role for like goals or objectives and policy objectives pursued by some group or some actor. And this is an important notion because states by definition pursue goals that are determined usually politically or legislatively or as part of some political process. Okay, so now that we've got a lot of input here, what I want to hone in on before we move forward is the following. The state is essentially a political organization, a political association of actors who share power and influence over a given community. Now, this is not our precise definition, but I want to give you kind of the snapshot. It is a political association that shares power and influence over a human community, and there's a given territoriality and specific boundaries associated with this community. Now, notice that that definition does not focus on geography. It does not focus on relationships to a larger country. It does not focus on a government exclusively. Instead, it deals with the association of different institutions who share power and influence in an institutional and organized way within a given territory in the enforcement of an order over a specific community. Now, this is very complex, I know, but we're going to develop this further, and let's begin to do so by unraveling the classic definition of the state in comparative politics. And this definition comes from Max Weber. Before I read the definition, and before we deal with it, let's take a look at the chat. We've got a few more contributions. Can you repeat the definition, please? Christiana, so I'm actually gonna, so let me repeat what I said. So the loose definition, before we deal with Weber's very specific definition, is the state is a political association that shares power and influence over a human community in a given territory. And this political association, sharing power and influence, is basically formed by political institutions, state institutions. That's the loose definition, a political association that shares power and influence over a human community. The specific definition comes from Max Weber, who is a famous sociologist and political economist, who said The state is that political association that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of violence in the enforcement of its order in a given territory. Now, that, I know, is a mouthful, but what you'll see as we go forward is that it's a very useful definition because it breaks down our understanding of the state into essentially three components. Those components are as follows. The state is a political association, that is, an organization of people who share power. This association has a successful monopoly of legitimate violence. That means that this association alone has obtained the legitimate power to exercise violence, the exclusive power to exercise violence. Only that association itself has the power to use violence within that given territory. And then that's our third dimension, in a given territory. So to recount, we have a political association that has established a successful monopoly of legitimate violence in the form of a claim to the power to use violence in a given territory. These are the three dimensions that form the classic Weberian definition. This definition, you'll see, encapsulates everything that is essential to our understanding of the state. Now, there's more to it, but this definition helps us to begin to see what we mean by the state. Now, what are the key dimensions that follow from this definition? They are as follows. A monopoly of legitimate violence, a specific, well-defined territoriality, sovereignty. It alone independently decides within that territory. A system of laws and norms. A system of laws and norms implemented and enforced by state institutions. A centralized bureaucratic organization with a clear hierarchy and a dispersion of authority along different ranks answerable to superiors within the context of specific organizations charged with specific objectives. These organizations enforce property rights, and they also maintain agencies for taxing and policing the population. State institutions extract revenue from the society, and they do so by creating a tax code. They tax economic activity so as to derive revenue that they then use to establish security forces necessary to police the population and enforce the rules developed by the state. And so this abstract political association sharing power with a successful monopoly of legitimate violence in a given territory does all these things and has all these qualities. These different dimensions of the state, as we understand it, help to frame our understanding of what we're actually analyzing and what we're looking at in the world when we look out and we use that term, the state. And so let's briefly deal with a very important issue, which is the issue of legitimacy. Now, what is a legitimate monopoly of violence? What does it mean to say that it's legitimate? It means to say that that behavior conforms to the law or to the rules that have been set. Now, what that means then is that there's a clear rule of law or set of rules about what can be done and what cannot be done. And what that means is that the state itself obeys those laws and those rules. Now, legitimacy and the right to use rightful or just violence confers authority. So conforming to the law or the rules about what the state can do and what it cannot confers authority. Only the state has the power to use violence. No other actors can use violence. This is why armed uprisings and armed groups are quickly suppressed by central governments who then weaponize the institutions of the state so as to extend authority and to reestablish order. Only the state has the power to organize and to wage such uprisings or to use violence in that way. Only the state has the power in a legitimate legal sense, in a way that conforms to the law or the rules about who exactly can use violence. The law says the state can use violence. The state can behave in a way that non-state actors cannot. Only the state has the power to use violence. Only the police or the military have the power to use violence, and so on and so forth. Now, as to this legitimacy itself, where does the legitimacy itself come from? If it's conforming to the law or the rules, we can imagine different sources of legitimacy, and those include traditional legitimacy, or sort of like your position in some social community or your kind of status based upon historical and kind of cultural factors that help shape the way that different elders or elites are viewed and how power is kind of distributed among different people within a community in some kind of a hierarchy. There's the charismatic form of legitimacy, which comes from the power, the charisma of a particular actor and their ability to arouse the sympathy of their subjects and the support of their subjects. And then finally, there's the rational legal legitimacy, which is that legitimacy which is inscribed in law and is based in the rules as they are set out legally in the Constitution, in the legal code, et cetera, and so on and so forth. Now, modern states, the ones that we're dealing with in this class, have mostly a rational legal legitimacy. Now, we'll deal with early states as well, but you'll see that the rational legal legitimacy is what corresponds to the reality that we face today, which is a set of very well-defined legal systems that rationalize and kind of legitimate the authority of state institutions and state actors. And so this legitimacy is vitally important because that legitimacy is what helps to confer authority, what the state institutions themselves can do. What are the police allowed to do? What can they do to you? Can they detain you for no reason? Or do they have to have a specific justification or some warrant even for maybe apprehending you in some way? It depends on what is actually conferred upon the state and the police by the legal code that is the basis for this rational legal legitimacy of state institutions. And so what states can do and what state actors can do to you and to others in society and how they can behave is always going to be based upon some rational legal basis, and conformity to those rules is what establishes legitimacy, and that confers authority. And so in this sense, legitimacy and authority are separate from power. Power is a capacity to bring about a specific outcome. That's separate from the legal architecture and the just or well substantiated or well solidified basis for legitimate authority. Power is something else. Now, you might be able to use power to change the legal code and change the rules so as to legitimate or confer more authority upon you, but power is still a separate quantity in this understanding. So legitimacy and authority go hand in hand, and it's from that rational legal sort of source of legitimacy that authority derives, and that's where state actors get their power. And so let's make this more concrete. Maybe you've protested. Maybe you've had encounters with security forces. I know that during some of my field work in Chile, I actually participated in some protests, in some marches, and had some encounters that involved security forces relating and acting like this, using pepper spray, or not pepper spray, but using various suppressants to deal with large crowds and large groups of protesters who might pose a threat to establish order or civility or so on, or that they think might pose a threat. Now, what we see here is an expression of state power. You have the police, a state institution, using their legitimate authority to exercise violence. And in this case, they appear to be using tear gas or something to spray this young woman. That is legitimate authority. They have the power to do that. Now, if you did that to the cops, they would arrest you and probably much worse than just that, because you don't have that authority. Only the police, only the state has that authority, that legitimate authority to use violence in a way that they determine in the moment is acceptable given the circumstances in which they find themselves. So we have state agents in the form of the police using violence to suppress a large protest that they may view as non-civil or as disruptive. Or maybe it's that the police and the state are an instrument of particular class interests who view these types of protests as problematic. Whatever the source, what we're observing here is an expression of state power, the use of legitimate violence. You might also think about the power of the state to stop you at a checkpoint. State agents in the form of, security forces or police or the military. In this case, we're looking at Afghanistan. Those are agents of the state. If you've ever been at a checkpoint or had to provide some kind of documentation arbitrarily for whatever reason, either here in the United States or somewhere else, that is an interaction often with state agents. Now, we'll see later that whether it's the state in charge might depend upon the strength of the state, because in some cases, local warlords and local groups can take control and exercise their own influence, thus weakening the state. But this is an interaction with the state. The state has the legitimate authority to stop you, assuming in this case that it's based in some legal basis that is sound. But assuming that's the case, only the state has the capacity or the power, the legal right to do this. And that is the meaning of legitimate authority in a monopoly of violence. That is the meaning of a monopoly of violence. Efren here. So with the Hong Kong protests, would that be an example of state oppressing its people? So, how you view that, it by definition is suppression. Suppression is simply containing protest or containing uprisings that might be viewed as challenging the authority of the state. And so by definition, this involves suppression. Now, the meaning of that and the consequences of that are sort of separate issues, but on a purely descriptive basis, this is what states do. They suppress uprisings and they suppress the discontent that might challenge the heart of the authority of the state in the political institutions that use these security forces and use these state institutions to express power. Now, states in development. The state is an enforcer of contracts and it's a provider of public goods and services. So whenever you enter into a business relationship, whenever you've signed a contract for either an apartment or a job or whatever, a new car, you're entering into an agreement with another party that is refereed and sort of enforced, so to speak, by the state, by institutions of the state like courts and other organizations of the state that sort of underwrite that agreement and make sure that both parties kind of conform to the lay of the agreement, so to speak, right? So you go to court to resolve differences or you seek mediation. When you do that, you're engaging institutions of the state. Now, on the same token, the state is also a provider of public goods and services. So those businesses into which you enter contracts with, those different actors involved in these relationships or agreements all depend on public goods and services that they cannot privately provide themselves or that might be more expensive for them to provide privately. Now, what is a public good? A public good is a product that one individual can consume without reducing its availability to another individual and from which no one is excluded. The reason that everyone can consume it without reducing its availability And the reason that no one is excluded is because it's provided by the state. These are things provided by state institutions. They're always provided by the state, no matter what. And examples include like roads and bridges, airports, street lighting, all the stuff that we tend to take for granted, but that is essential to the success of the economy and the society. These are public goods. They're not provided by private entities. They're provided by the state, as we understand it, the state. The state provides these and always will. And it will never be the case that they're extinguished or that one person can have it and someone else can't. By definition, they're available to everyone. Now, public services are services which are provided by the government to people living within the jurisdiction of the state or of that central government. And so this includes like schools, healthcare, the post office, and the police. Public services are as important as public goods because those services are also essential to the functioning of the economy. There's a debate right now in the United States about balloting and mail-in voting. And it's in some ways kind of maybe potentially a false debate, but there's a debate about whether that public service is so essential that it should override what some view as concerns about the potential for fraud associated with mail-in voting. Now let's get real. There is no potential for fraud, but the whole debate centers on this public service that we take for granted and that many of us until now have really probably never thought much about, the post office. The post office is vitally important. It's a public service like any other. Now, the question of politics in the state is an important question, and it helps us to understand how these big concepts relate to each other and how, as we go forward, politics will remain important to what we do with the state. Now, we understand politics as the activity through which people make, preserve, and amend the general rules under which they live. Now, those general rules decided in politics are implemented and enforced by the institutions of the state. So state institutions are involved in imposing the rules that are determined and chosen in politics through the political process. Now, the ability or the capacity of state institutions to implement and enforce those rules, given objectives and constraints, that's what we call state strength. And this is where we begin to pivot. And we're going to develop and look at and conceptualize and even measure this concept of state strength in a couple different cases here momentarily. But I want you to focus on the idea of the ability of state institutions to do what they intend to do or what they set out to do. We've already discussed how states do a number of different things, hypothetically, theoretically, conceptually. Now think about how different states might vary in their capacity to implement and enforce those general rules. You can imagine states of different strengths. And this brings up the next question that we encounter, which is, how can state strength be measured? How can we assess different degrees of stateness, if you will? That is, if we can imagine that states vary in terms of their ability to do what they set out to do and to pursue their specific objectives, how can we measure that variation? We've got 3 indicators that we're working with here. And these indicators are going to become important to what we do in the remainder of this course, or this class, excuse me, because we're going to be using these indicators here momentarily to analyze some data. So I've got 3 indicators that roughly correspond to the main elements or dimensions of state strength. First, spatial and societal reach. This is the question of, are state institutions present in all parts of the territory? That is, do they have a firm established presence throughout the country? So, or more specifically, the territory. And this takes the values of either yes or no. We've got relations with social actors. The question here is, do societal actors accept the state's authority? And is the state able to enforce the rule of law? Yes or no? And finally, we've got the provision of public goods and services. Is the state able to provide security to its citizens? Yes or no? So these are our three components or dimensions of state strength. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at how, we're going to take a look at how we can use these indicators to analyze data and categorize different states based upon their strength or their weakness. And so we have then three dimensions that we'll use to form our categories and to categorize states. And what we'll do is we'll score strong states yes if they have all three indicators. That is to say, if they have yes, states will score yes if they will score strong if they have yes for all three indicators. I'm sorry, it's been a long morning already. If they have yes for all three indicators, we'll score them as strong states. We'll score them as weak states if they score no for one or more indicators. And so what that means then is strong states will have to have all three of our dimensions, and weak states will lack one or more of those dimensions. And what that gives us then are two categories. We have strong states who control their territories and secure them from political and criminal violence. In these places, peace and order and rule of law rule the day. The state has an established presence and secures society from political and criminal violence. The territory itself is under the total control of the state, or the central government more specifically. Now, weak states, on the other hand, do not control all their territories and cannot secure them from violence. In these places, peace, order, and rule of law are all going to be attenuated. There'll be substantially more violence, non-state violence specifically, that is illegitimate violence, violence exerted and used by actors who are not state actors and who do not have the legitimate authority to use violence. So these weak states will be very different from these strong states. And again, strong states require the value of yes on all three indicators. They must have reach, authority, and security. Weak states, on the other hand, will lack one or more of those. And so we've got then these two categories, and we're going to do an analysis, a sort of conceptual analysis. It's not analytical, we're categorizing here. But we're going to look at India. We're going to measure state strength in India. Our outcome of interest is state strength. We've got two values that it can take, strong or weak. The cases are India between 1947, independence, and 2000, and then India 2001 to the present day. These are two time periods that roughly correspond to two different outcomes. And what we'll take a look at is three dimensions of the state in these different cases. Those three dimensions are our three dimensions that we identified as part of our measure just a moment ago. And they are, to remind us, spatial and societal reach, relations with social actors, and the provision of public goods and services in the form of security. So we've got then our research design, and I'm going to now show you the data or the values along the different dimensions of state strength in these two cases from India. And what we're going to do is we're going to fill in the blanks. So we ask ourselves, in what category of state is India 1947 to 2000? And in what category of state is India 2001 to present? So tell us in the chat, let us know, and I'll take a look at your input before we move on and do another exercise here in a moment that will help to extend this example further. Good. I'm happy to report that we're all on the same page. And though this may seem obvious to you, I want you to experience the process of examining data and reaching conclusions about categories and about how we're using these measures. I want you to experience this process in the steps involved, because this is what you'll be doing in your own work. So we are going to continue doing these exercises as part of our analysis in the class. And I think that they'll be useful to you, even if it seems in some instances to be pretty straightforward. Good, good. So we're all on the same page here. So let's take a look then at what we've got here. And as you all point out very clearly, India from 1947 to 2000 is really a weak state because it lacked all three dimensions of state strength. It lacked societal reach, it lacked accepted authority among people in society, and it didn't have a provision of security. It didn't deliver security as a vital public good. And in this regard, it was a weak state, very clearly. Now, India from 2001 to the present is really categorized as a strong state because it possessed all three dimensions of state strength. And so easily, we see the contrast. Whereas between 1947 and 2000, all three dimensions were absent. They're all present from 2001 to the present day in the form of societal reach, acceptance of authority, and the provision of security. And so then we have these two different states, these two different outcomes in the case of India. These two temporal cases, as we call them, represent the variation in the outcome of interest, which is state strength. Now, what happened in India? Many of you may be asking, well, what's the story? You know, what was going on there in the period from 2001 to the present day that wasn't happening between 1947 and 2000? What is the nature of the strengthening of the state in India, in other words? And to answer your question, it has a lot to do with the number of armed insurgencies faced by the central government. So between 1947 and 2000, in these provinces here, these northeastern provinces, or with the present day provinces, there were many armed insurgencies, lots of groups organized and taking up arms against the central government, seeking either autonomy or independence or more, local control. And these armed insurgencies were so numerous that it severely compromised the capacity of the central government to extend control, be present in all parts of the territory, provide security, and moreover, to really have its authority accepted widely throughout the territory. So in this sense, the armed insurgencies were the source of that weakness. What caused those armed insurgencies may be a separate question, but on a purely descriptive level, what was happening in India, the nature of state weakness during that period was closely linked to those armed insurgencies. But the situation is very different since 2001. So since 2001, the number of insurgencies has actually fallen sharply. So whereas between 47 and 2000, there were dozens and dozens of uprisings, since 2001, there have been far fewer, and the numbers have fallen so sharply that in 2019, as few as 17 people died as a result of insurgencies waged in those provinces. Contrast that with 1,700 in 2000 at the height of disorder in that earlier period. So we see then that these two time periods went very different ways in India. And India then represents an interesting puzzle because we want to know maybe why those two different time periods went different ways. And this begins to get us to questions about research design and about what type of a puzzle this is that we've identified here in the cases of India. And so I want to put it to you as sort of a bonus. What type of comparative case study design do these cases conform to? So this set of cases, these temporal cases, India at time 1 and India at time 2, what type of a comparative design do those cases form? Tell us in the chat, either privately or the class, but let's take your input and see if we can pick up on that as a bonus before we deal with some more data here in a moment. Let us know in the chat. What type of comparative design does this set of cases conform to? Time 1 and time 2. Any takers? So Stephen says method of agreement because they're time periods with very different attributes but have resulted in one solid outcome? Question mark. Does anyone want to respond to Stephen, or does anyone have additional points that would support that position, or does someone have another position? Let's see if there's another perspective. What type of comparative design? Method of agreement or method of difference? Or, to put it differently, most similar systems design or most different systems design? If we're comparing these two time periods as cases, would we use the method of agreement? Oh, so Nina says most similar systems design as the cases have similar traits but different outcomes. Nina is correct. It's a most similar systems design. And in fact, it's kind of the ideal most similar systems design because the cases have very, very similar traits. It's the same country. It didn't change that much during those time periods, but they have very different outcomes. They've got state weakness during one period and state strength during another. And so we would use then the method of difference to try to figure out what was different between those time periods that helps to explain variation in the outcome. It's a most similar systems design, and it's a classic one. In your own research, you might also consider using temporal cases to sort of create more robust analyses and build better theories. Anna Martha says, method of difference because India is a multicultural country. So it would be the method of difference. The multicultural component, I don't know how that would relate directly, although it's certainly true that during both time periods, it was a multicultural country with the legacies of the caste system as well as a lot of diversity religiously and ethnically as well. And so the fact that both cases have that multicultural component is relevant because it means it's the same country. It's a very tight comparison, a tight set of similarities between the cases. The cases help to eliminate a lot of other variables that might contend or be explanatory because they're so similar along so many dimensions. Good, good. So it's a most similar systems design with the method of difference approach. Now, what we're going to do as we round out this lecture is we're going to extend the example. And I want you to once again fill in the blanks and ask yourself, in what category of state are countries 1 through 5? And you'll categorize these states, these countries, if you will, again, by looking at their values on our 3 dimensions of state strength: societal reach, accepted authority, and provision of security. Take a look at those values and then categorize those different countries according to different levels of state strength. And then in a moment, I'll show you my results and we'll double check to make sure that we're all on the same page. So let us know in the chat. We've got a few minutes here, but I think we can still get it done. Good, Adriana. You can message me privately or you can message the class based on whatever you want to do. I will give us all a chance here to respond before I give it away. Good, Nina. Good, Miguel. Good, Alexis. That's a very nuanced take. You're looking at degrees of strength from strongest to weakest. Interesting, but you're correct. Good, Stephen. Good, Isis. Good, Valentine. Good, Karen. That's right, Jorge. Good, good. So I think that we're on the same page. I'm seeing a lot of continuity here, and I'm happy to report that you're getting this, and it seems to be very, very intuitive for you, and I'm happy about that. Take a look here. I think there are a few more chats coming in. Good, Jose. So let's take a look at the results then. As all of you point out, only country 4 is strong. The remaining countries are all weak, and it's because, again, we only categorize the state as strong if it has all 3 dimensions of state strength. So it requires yes in all 3 categories. It requires yes in all 3. If it doesn't have yes across all 3, we categorize it as weak. Now, there may be degrees of weakness or degrees of strength, but we need all 3 dimensions of state strength in order to categorize it as a strong state. Otherwise, we categorize it as a weak state. And in this way, we develop measures to fit concepts and then actually examine and measure levels of state strength in the real world. And what I want you to see from this lecture and this lesson today is that the measures that we use matter a great deal because they can help us to differentiate between slight changes across time in individual cases or small changes across countries that might have similar experiences but different outcomes, or different experiences but similar outcomes. And so these measures will help us to take a closer look at state formation. And on Thursday, what we'll do is we'll examine some theories of state formation, and we'll examine some data again and take a close look at some of the patterns that emerge across countries that are very different in some cases and very similar in others. And so we'll continue using methods, we'll continue using data, we'll continue engaging with theories and hypotheses, and we'll have a discussion and have some input and really engage all the senses. I look forward to it. You can stay after and chat with me for a little while if you want. Otherwise, I am going to stop the recording here momentarily, and I'm happy to take any questions, but you are free to go, and you can find this recording on YouTube and linked on CAD courses later this afternoon. Hey, thank you, everybody.
Oh, I just had a quick question.
Yeah.
And sorry, I tried fixing my screening, but since my little sister uses my computer, so it's like kind of embarrassing because I'm like, oh no, like for my user